What could possibly make a man, surrounded by luxury and privilege, look into the eyes of someone who serves his family and declare with cold certainty, "You don't belong here"? Imagine standing in a grand mansion in New York City, where marble floors gleam, crystal chandeliers hang heavy with light, and every corner whispers of wealth. Now imagine that very setting turning into the stage for one of the most humiliating lessons a wealthy heir would ever endure. Have you ever seen someone so blinded by arrogance that they fail to recognize the truth standing right in front of them? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may surprise you. Michael, the only son of a wealthy family, had always lived with the belief that money could buy status, respect, and unquestioned authority. He walked through his mansion as if it were not just his inheritance, but his kingdom. The staff, maids, cooks, gardeners, were not people in his eyes. They were roles, shadows moving about the edges of his life to ensure his comfort. Among them was Sarah, a maid who carried herself with quiet strength, a woman who had worked in that house for years, unnoticed, uncelebrated, and yet essential. It was on a stormy evening, with thunder rumbling over the city, that the tension between them finally snapped. Michael, dressed in his tailored suit, stood in the grand hallway, his voice cutting through the silence. "You don't belong in this mansion," he told Sarah, his words sharp, designed to wound. His tone wasn't just about authority, it was about superiority. He saw her not as a human being, but as someone beneath him, unworthy of sharing the same roof, unworthy of even existing in his world. But Sarah didn't respond with anger. She didn't argue, didn't shout, didn't even defend herself. She simply lowered her gaze, her silence speaking louder than any protest could. Have you ever been in a situation where silence carried more power than words? In that moment, her quiet dignity unsettled Michael more than open defiance ever could. And just when Michael believed he had won, when he thought his arrogance had triumphed, a voice echoed through the hall, a voice he never expected to hear in that way. It was Margaret, his mother, the true matriarch of the house. She didn't raise her tone, but the weight of her words shifted the air around them. For the first time, Michael realized that he was not the master of this story. Why would his own mother, the woman who raised him, stand by the maid he wanted to throw out? Why would she look at Sarah not as the help, but with the respect and loyalty that Michael himself had never shown? What truth did Margaret know that her son had overlooked all his life? The clash wasn't just about a son versus a maid. It was about pride versus humility, wealth versus loyalty, and arrogance versus truth. And in that moment, the balance of power in the mansion began to shift. What Michael didn't know was that Sarah carried with her a history tied deeply to his own family, a story buried in the past that would soon rise to the surface and turn his certainty into shame. This wasn't just a confrontation. It was the beginning of a revelation that would leave Michael questioning everything he believed about worth, family, and belonging. Stay close, because as this story unfolds, you'll see how one shocking truth can dismantle years of pride in an instant. What happens next in this mansion will not only change Michael's life, it might just change the way you think about loyalty, gratitude, and the true meaning of family. And maybe, as you hear this scene unfolding, you've remembered a moment in your own life when someone judged you unfairly, or when silence spoke louder than 1,000 words. If this stirred something inside you, I'd love to know. Leave a comment below sharing your experience or even just how this story is resonating with you right now. Believe me, when you share, it's not just words on a screen. It's a way of building a community where people see themselves reflected in each other's stories. And while you're here, if the emotions in this narrative are pulling you in, don't forget to tap that like button. It might feel like a small action, but it helps this channel keep growing and ensures that more people can find stories that inspire reflection and change. And if you're the kind of person who values content that goes beyond surface-level entertainment, stories that explore injustice, resilience, and the surprising power of human connection. Make sure to subscribe. That way you'll always know when the next story is ready, and you'll be part of the journey with me from the very beginning. Your support, your presence here, is what makes it possible to continue telling these stories, to bring voices of humility against arrogance, and to highlight the quiet truths that often go unheard. So take a second, join in, and let's walk through these lessons together. Because what's about to unfold in Michael's mansion is only the beginning. The mansion stood like a monument to ambition itself, stretching across acres of carefully sculpted land in the quieter suburbs of New York. Its white stone facade reflected the pale afternoon light, while wrought iron gates guarded the entrance, as if protecting a kingdom. Behind those gates, winding driveways lined with oak trees led to a fountain carved from marble, its water cascading in endless motion, a display meant to impress visitors. Before they even stepped inside, every detail screamed of luxury and power, the kind of wealth that doesn't just buy possessions, but commands respect. Yet within those walls, behind the polished glass and the glimmering chandeliers, another story was unfolding, one where the balance of power was not what it seemed. Inside, the mansion was a world of its own. The grand staircase curved gracefully upward, its banister polished to a shine so flawless it reflected the light like a mirror. Persian rugs stretched across the floors, muffling footsteps, while oil paintings of distant ancestors watched from the walls, their gazes stern, as though reminding everyone who entered that this was not just a house, it was legacy. Michael believed that legacy was his birthright. He walked those halls with the confidence of someone who thought the marble beneath his feet existed solely to support him. To him, the mansion wasn't just home, it was proof of superiority. Sarah, by contrast, moved like a shadow in this palace. She carried trays of crystal glasses and polished silver with quiet precision. She knew the rhythm of the house better than anyone, when the lights should dim, when the curtains should be drawn, when silence was required. Her uniform was simple, black and white, meant to make her blend into the background, and yet there was a presence about her, a calm strength that couldn't be hidden no matter how modestly she dressed. She had been in that mansion long enough to know its secrets, long enough to see moments no outsider ever would. Michael never considered that. To him, Sarah was invisible, her worth measured only in the tasks she performed. "Don't linger in the hallways," he once said sharply, catching her with a dusting cloth in hand. "People shouldn't see you standing around." His words weren't about the work being done, they were about the image he wanted to project. The mansion, in his mind, was a theater, and Sarah was part of the scenery, useful when needed, invisible otherwise. But here lies the hidden truth of power. What looks permanent can shift in an instant, and what seems insignificant often carries the deepest impact. While Michael admired the towering ceilings and the imported marble floors, Sarah noticed the cracks that spread quietly in the corners, the places where dust settled no matter how often it was cleaned. She understood that perfection was an illusion, maintained only by constant, unseen labor. That knowledge gave her a different kind of authority, one Michael would never acknowledge, at least not willingly. The imbalance between them wasn't only financial, it was rooted in mindset. Michael equated wealth with value, believing that possessions defined identity. Sarah, however, lived with an entirely different perspective. Every day she walked into rooms overflowing with gold-trimmed furniture, and yet she never envied what she dusted. She measured life not by objects, but by resilience, by choices, by the quiet dignity of surviving and carrying on. There were times she caught fragments of herself in the mirrors scattered throughout the mansion. In those reflections, she didn't see the maid. She saw a woman who had endured, a woman who carried stories within her that none of these walls could contain. And though she remained silent when Michael dismissed her, there was a depth behind her eyes that suggested she knew truths he couldn't begin to imagine. Michael, on the other hand, was obsessed with Appearances. He made sure the driveway was always clear of leaves when guests arrived, that the dining room table was set with precision, that the house glowed at night like a beacon of wealth. He believed power resided in how others perceived him. "This house represents who we are," he once told a visiting friend, sweeping his arm across the massive living room. "It shows people we've made it." His voice carried pride, but underneath it lingered insecurity. What Michael couldn't see was that Sarah was part of that we. Without her, the illusion would falter, the rooms would gather dust, the table would sit bare, and the hidden gears that kept the mansion's image alive would grind to a halt. He was blind to the simple fact that power is never absolute. It always depends on someone else, somewhere, quietly holding the weight. It is in these contrasts, the marble floor beneath polished shoes and the worn soles of work shoes that cross it every morning, that the true drama emerges. Because wealth can build walls, yes, but it cannot erase the humanity of those who live within them. And while Michael believed his mansion placed him above others, Sarah knew something he didn't, that behind the grandeur, behind the carefully constructed appearances, the real strength of a household lies not in the gold leaf on its walls, but in the unseen hands that keep it standing. And so, every corner of that mansion carried two realities. For Michael, it was a palace of privilege. For Sarah, it was a workplace, a reminder of imbalance, but also a quiet stage where her endurance, her patience, and her quiet dignity played out day after day. That duality was always present, though only one side of it had ever been acknowledged. But soon, the fragile balance of these worlds would be disturbed, revealing revelations that had been buried beneath years of silence. The truth was waiting, just beneath the polished surface, ready to rise and shift the very foundation of what Michael thought he controlled. And as the storm outside gathered its voice, echoing through the mansion's tall windows, the cracks between arrogance and humility began to widen. Michael was the kind of man who carried his wealth like a weapon. Every step he took through the mansion was heavy with entitlement, as though the marble floors existed only to echo his presence. He had grown up surrounded by luxury, and that upbringing had carved into him a mindset that left little room for humility. The house, staff, from the butler to the gardeners, were invisible until they failed to meet his standards. When they performed well, he saw it not as their effort, but as his right. "If I'm paying for perfection," he once said while adjusting his cufflinks, "then perfection is what I expect." That attitude shaped the atmosphere of the entire household. Conversations among the staff often paused when Michael entered a room, not out of respect, but out of caution. His voice could turn sharp without warning, and his eyes carried the cold weight of judgment. He demanded control in every detail, the way the silverware was laid out on the dining table, the angle of the curtains when drawn at dusk, even the temperature of the wine served to his guests. His pride wasn't in the mansion itself, but in the dominance he felt inside it. To Michael, the mansion wasn't just his home. It was a stage that displayed his success, and everyone else was cast in supporting roles. Sarah understood this better than anyone. She had worked under his commands long enough to know when silence was safer than speaking, when a lowered gaze could shield her from unnecessary conflict. Yet there was something unshakable in her, a quiet resilience that Michael mistook for submission. What he never realized was that her silence wasn't weakness, it was restraint. Still, he pressed his advantage every chance he got, as though reminding her of her place kept his own power intact. "You should be grateful you even get to work." "Here," he once muttered, tossing his jacket across the back of a chair and expecting Sarah to pick it up. "Most people would give anything to walk through these doors." His words weren't gratitude. They were a reminder of hierarchy, a declaration that she should never forget the gap between their lives. Michael thrived on appearances. When guests arrived, he transformed into the polished host, his arrogance masked by charm. He bragged about the size of his property, the history of the paintings, On the walls, the exclusivity of the wines in his cellar. He wanted admiration, validation, the kind of attention that made his ego swell. Yet when the guests left, the mask fell away, revealing the sharp edges of his personality that those closest to him knew all too well. For the staff, including Sarah, he didn't bother with charm. For them, he reserved only orders, criticisms, and the occasional careless insult. The irony was that beneath his pride, Michael carried an insecurity he would never admit. His sense of self-worth was tied entirely to what people thought of him, and the mansion was his shield. He couldn't imagine life without the admiration wealth brought him. He couldn't imagine being seen as ordinary. That fear made him cling to control even harder, ensuring that no one inside his world could ever challenge the image he projected. One afternoon, as the sun spilled through the tall windows of the library, Michael found Sarah dusting near the shelves. He stood in the doorway, watching her work, and instead of appreciating her effort, he sneered. "Don't you ever wonder if this is all you'll ever be?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. Sarah didn't look up, her hand steady as she wiped the edge of a frame. "I know who I am," she replied softly. That answer unsettled him. He expected her to shrink, to apologize, to accept his dominance. But her calmness was impenetrable, and that frustrated him more than open defiance would have. In Michael's eyes, every person in the mansion was a tool, objects that existed to polish his image, to maintain his comfort, to ensure his superiority remained unchallenged. He had no patience for mistakes, no tolerance for what he considered weakness. If a maid dropped a glass, he scolded her in front of others, not because of the loss of the glass, but because it disrupted the flawless world he believed he owned. If a gardener left a leaf on the driveway, Michael pointed it out, reminding him that perfection was non-negotiable. "Details are everything," he would say. But what he really meant was that control was everything. This obsession with control extended even to his mother. Though he owed his lifestyle to her careful management of the family fortune, he often dismissed her advice as old-fashioned. Margaret had tried more than once to remind him that respect mattered more than riches, that humility was a form of strength. Michael brushed her off, believing her words belonged to another era. "The world isn't about kindness, Mother," he said during one of their tense dinners. "It's about winning, and I don't intend to lose." Yet in his relentless pursuit of dominance, Michael never noticed the cracks forming in the world he thought was solid. He never realized that arrogance can only hold power for so long before truth begins to erode it. The staff, though quiet, noticed everything. The sharpness of his words, the weight of his demands, the way he treated Sarah as though she were an object, rather than a human being. Behind closed doors, they whispered, wondering how long it would be before his pride led to a downfall. The imbalance between Michael and Sarah wasn't simply about class or money. It was about perspective. Michael saw himself as untouchable, armored by wealth. Sarah saw through the illusion. She understood that wealth could buy possessions but not respect, status but not integrity. And though she endured his dismissiveness day after day, there was a strength in her. Silence that foreshadowed something even Michael couldn't anticipate. The mansion, so polished on the surface, was beginning to feel like a stage for something larger, something that couldn't be hidden forever. Because behind every arrogant decision, behind every dismissive word, the truth was gathering momentum, waiting for the moment when control would slip from Michael's grasp and the weight of his own pride would turn against him. The storm outside was still rising, and soon the perfect image he fought so hard to protect would collide with revelations that would change everything. Sarah had been in the mansion so long that she seemed woven into its walls, yet few people truly saw her. She moved with a kind of rhythm that belonged not to luxury but to survival, each step purposeful, every gesture measured. Her days began before dawn, often before the family stirred, and ended only when the last light in the house was dimmed. from polishing the marble floors until they reflected, the chandeliers to quietly arranging fresh flowers in the vases that lined the hallways. Sarah's work shaped the very atmosphere Michael boasted about to his guests. Yet in his eyes, she was invisible, a fixture of the house, rather than a human being with a story. But there was something about Sarah that set her apart from what Michael assumed she was. While her uniform was meant to strip away individuality, she carried herself with a dignity that not even the plainest attire could conceal. She wasn't loud, she wasn't confrontational, and she never argued when faced with Michael's dismissive remarks. Her strength wasn't in defiance, but in patience, in silence, in the steady way she endured. It was the kind of quiet power that often goes unnoticed until the moment it changes everything. On more than one occasion, the other staff had whispered about how Sarah could withstand Michael's sharp tongue. When he threw casual insults or demanded perfection with impossible standards, she never let his words pierce her calm. "Doesn't it bother you when he talks like that?" a younger maid once asked her, her voice filled with frustration. Sarah only smiled faintly and replied, "Words can bruise for a moment, but they can't define who you are unless you let them." That was her mindset, one shaped by years of hardship long before she ever stepped foot in the mansion. Her story, though hidden from Michael, was marked by resilience. She had once worked 2 jobs while raising her younger sister after their parents passed away unexpectedly. She had walked through winters in upstate New York, with shoes that barely held together, carrying groceries in paper bags that tore against the cold wind. She had learned early that life wasn't about what you had, but how you endured what you didn't. That journey had carved into her a strength that money couldn't buy, a kind of inner steel that no insult from a wealthy heir could bend. Sometimes, late at night, when the mansion grew quiet and everyone else was asleep, Sarah would walk through the empty halls. She would pause at the grand piano in the living room, running her fingers gently across the keys without pressing down. Music had once been part of her life. Her mother had taught her simple songs when she was a child. Standing there in the dim light, surrounded by wealth she could never claim, Sarah didn't feel envy. Instead, she felt perspective. She knew that the true measure of a person wasn't the gold frames or the sprawling gardens, but the decisions they made when no one was watching. Michael never noticed those moments. He never noticed how Sarah's presence carried a grounding effect, how the household often leaned on her steadiness. When other staff grew nervous under his watchful eye, Sarah's calm helped them carry on. When Margaret, his mother, fell ill and required extra care, it was Sarah who stayed quietly by her side, ensuring comfort without ever expecting recognition. Margaret had seen it, though she noticed the small sacrifices, the quiet loyalty. That awareness would become the seed of the revelation Michael least expected. What made Sarah's strength remarkable was its invisibility. She didn't seek attention, didn't proclaim her worth, and didn't demand respect. She simply lived it. She understood that transformation didn't always come through grand gestures, but through consistency, through showing up every day with integrity. Her mindset wasn't about fighting battles with words, but about proving value through presence. That kind of strength is easy to overlook in a world obsessed with noise, but it has the power to reshape even the most rigid hearts when the truth finally surfaces. Michael once confronted her in the dining room after a minor mistake, a glass placed slightly out of alignment. His voice carried the usual edge. "How hard is it to follow simple instructions?" he snapped. Sarah didn't flinch. She gently moved the glass into place and said softly, "Perfection is fragile, Michael. It doesn't take much to disturb it." For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. Her words weren't rebellion, but they carried a weight that unsettled him. It was as if she had reminded him of something he wanted to ignore, that his carefully curated world was more fragile than he liked to believe. This ability to deliver truth without confrontation was part of Sarah's quiet strength. She had a way of holding up a mirror without forcing anyone to look, of planting seeds of reflection that grew silently over time. And though Michael brushed off her remark with a scoff, the thought lingered with him longer than he admitted. Behind the scenes of the mansion's grandeur, Sarah's influence was subtle but profound. She represented a hidden truth, that humility can exist even in places of arrogance, and that endurance often leaves a deeper impact than dominance. While Michael measured his worth in possessions and control, Sarah measured hers in resilience and grace. The contrast between them was not just about wealth and poverty, but about values, about the journey each had taken to stand where they were. It was this contrast, this invisible tension, that began to shift the energy inside the mansion. Because even though Michael dismissed her as insignificant, Sarah's very presence challenged the foundation of his arrogance. Every act of quiet loyalty, every display of patience, was a revelation waiting to be uncovered, a reminder that true strength often hides in the most unexpected places. And as the storm outside grew louder, rattling the tall windows and echoing through the long hallways, the imbalance between them became harder to ignore. The stage was being set for a moment when Sarah's hidden connection to the family would no longer remain in the shadows, and Michael's control over his world would begin to slip. The journey of transformation, though silent for now, was already underway, carried not by power or pride, but by the quiet strength of a woman who refused to be broken. The storm outside had grown heavier by the hour, rain pelting against the mansion's tall windows like an urgent knock that refused to be ignored. Inside, however, Michael's voice was louder than the thunder. His impatience echoed through the grand hallway, his words slicing into the silence with the precision of someone accustomed to authority. Sarah had just finished setting the table in the dining room, her movements calm and deliberate, when Michael's anger spilled over. He stood at the head of the table, staring at her as if she were an intruder in his carefully ordered world. "You don't belong here," he said, his tone sharp, filled with disdain. "This is not your home, and it never will be." The words hung in the air, heavy and cruel, but Sarah didn't flinch. She looked at him with quiet eyes, eyes that carried years of endurance, eyes that knew truths Michael had never cared to learn. That look alone unsettled him, though he didn't admit it. The clash between them wasn't new. Michael had been building toward this moment for months, maybe years, every arrogant remark layering over the last. To him, the mansion was sacred ground, a symbol of victory, of legacy, of superiority. And in his mind, Sarah's very presence in those rooms diminished its value. It was as if he couldn't reconcile the image of wealth he wanted to project with the reality that it depended on people like her. For Sarah, the insult was nothing she hadn't endured before, though this time it cut deeper. She had worked tirelessly, giving parts of herself to this household that no paycheck could truly repay. Yet her silence wasn't surrender. It was control. She refused to give Michael the satisfaction of anger. Instead, her restraint spoke louder than any words could. Michael, irritated by her calm, pressed further. "Do you think because you've been here for years that makes you something more than the help? Don't mistake kindness from my mother as permission to overstep. This house is mine, and you should never forget your place." "I haven't forgotten," Sarah replied softly, her voice steady. "But maybe you have." The sentence was quiet, almost whispered, yet it struck Michael harder than if she had shouted. Her words slipped under his armor, forcing him to feel the weight of something he couldn't quite name. He scoffed, pretending her remark hadn't touched him, but deep inside, it left a trace of unease. This was Michael's greatest weakness. He demanded obedience, but he feared truth. He needed the illusion of control to validate his identity. Any crack in that facade, any reminder that power doesn't guarantee respect, threatened the image he had built for himself. And Sarah, with her quiet strength, was a constant reminder that his authority wasn't as absolute as he wanted to believe. The other staff, those silent witnesses, felt the tension building with every exchange. They admired Sarah for her composure, for the way she could stand in the face of Michael's arrogance without being diminished. To them, she wasn't just the maid. She was the anchor of the household, the person who carried the weight of tasks that went unseen, the person who brought a kind of order even in the chaos of Michael's temper. What Michael failed to see was that Sarah's connection to the family wasn't defined by her uniform. Her history with the mansion went deeper than cleaning rooms and setting tables. She had been there during Margaret's most vulnerable moments, sitting quietly by her bedside during nights of illness, offering comfort without ever expecting acknowledgement. She had held secrets, protected dignity, and sacrificed her own rest so that the family could remain undisturbed. These were the behind-the-scenes truths that Michael ignored, the hidden foundation upon which his world of luxury stood. Margaret had seen it all, though she rarely spoke of it. She recognized the loyalty in Sarah's actions, the unspoken gratitude owed to her. And though Michael dismissed Sarah as expendable, Margaret carried an understanding that her son had yet to grasp. The mansion's true strength wasn't built on wealth or appearances, but on the quiet resilience of people like Sarah who gave more than they took. Michael, however, had no patience for such perspective. "You think silence makes you strong," he told her one evening, his voice dripping with contempt. "But silence only makes you small." Sarah looked at him, her expression steady, unshaken. "Silence doesn't make me small," she answered. "It keeps me standing when others would fall." It was an answer Michael didn't know how to process. It carried a truth he wasn't ready to confront, a truth about mindset, about endurance, about the difference between having power and being strong. His pride refused to accept it, yet somewhere deep inside, her words planted a seed of doubt. The confrontation that night wasn't just about hierarchy. It was about identity, about the choices that define who we are when stripped of titles and wealth. Michael believed his decisions were unquestionable, but Sarah's presence was a constant reminder that even the most carefully constructed image could be shaken by something as simple as dignity. The storm outside roared louder, thunder rattling the chandeliers above them, but the storm inside the mansion was louder still. Michael's arrogance clashed against Sarah's quiet strength, each moment revealing more of the cracks in his carefully maintained control. And as Margaret's footsteps approached from down the hall, the atmosphere shifted. Michael didn't yet realize it, but his mother was about to step into the conflict, bringing with her a revelation that would challenge everything he thought he knew. The balance of power in the mansion was about to change, not through Michael's commands, but through truths long hidden, truths that could no longer remain in the shadows. And it would be Sarah's presence, calm, unwavering, undeniable, that would serve as the catalyst for that transformation. The day the line was crossed didn't announce itself with fireworks. It began with routine, breakfast trays, the smell of fresh coffee drifting through the east wing, the low hum of a vacuum in distant corridors, until Michael found a reason to turn ordinary into offense. He was already in a brittle mood, a restlessness that made his impatience flare over small things. The rain outside pressed against the windows like a reminder that the world had its own rhythm, but Michael wanted control. He stepped into the study where family memorabilia sat behind glass. Old photographs, a bronze letter opener, a dusty baseball signed by a player his grandfather once admired. Sarah was there, dusting the shelves. She held a soft cloth, careful hands moving gently along the frames to make the glass shine. There was no drama in her work, only steady attention, yet in Michael's eyes the scene was a violation waiting to be named. "What are you doing in here without permission?" he snapped, as though the air itself had turned offensive. His gaze went to the baseball, to the letters on the desk, to the framed photo of his father with a senator from decades ago. "This is family property. You don't need to be near any of it." "It's on the schedule for cleaning," Sarah said, her voice even. "I always handle the study on Thursdays." "Don't act like you own a schedule," he shot back. "You follow instructions. You don't create them." She lowered the cloth and stepped aside, creating space, as if the air deserved more room than she did. She didn't argue. She knew that chasing logic with someone committed to dominance was like sprinting into wind, but her calm was not submission, and that made him angrier. The more composed she became, the less power he felt his words carried. He stalked closer to the display case and touched the old baseball as if to reclaim it from a threat. "People like you shouldn't be handling these things," he said. "These are pieces of history, my family's history." Sarah's eyes flicked to the photograph and back to the frame she'd been cleaning. "I'm careful with what matters," she said quietly. "I always have been." That sentence found a place to land in the room, steady and grounded, and for a second Michael felt something he couldn't name. He brushed it away. "Careful isn't enough," he said, turning his back and opening the desk drawer with a hard pull. "You shouldn't be in rooms like this at all. Who told you to come in here? Who allowed you near these belongings?" "No one needs to allow me," she answered. "I'm doing my job." "Your job," he repeated slowly, "is to keep out of sight unless someone needs you." Her gaze lowered, not out of shame, but out of choice. She understood the difference. She took a small step backward, not retreating, but creating a margin of quiet that belonged to her. Michael read it as defiance. He moved toward the door and called for the butler, his voice rising through the hall. When no one came immediately, his irritation snapped like a live wire. "You're done," he said, pointing toward the entrance. "Pack your things. I don't want you in this house another day." Sarah didn't speak. The study filled with the sound of rain on glass and the soft tick of the mantel clock. She looked at the photograph on the wall, the one of Michael's father at a charity gala from long ago, and then at the case, holding the memories of a family. She had spent years serving. Her life was not in those frames, but she had protected them all the same. Something in her expression told Michael that he was not the judge he believed himself to be. It unsettled him because it pushed against his narrative. His decisions had always been accepted. Now her silence felt like a mirror he didn't want to face. "I won't ask again," he said. "You're leaving, today." "I've never taken anything that didn't belong to me," she replied finally, voice steady. "And I've never touched what I couldn't return in the same condition or better." "Don't lecture me," he snapped. "You're a guest here on a paycheck." "I'm not a guest," she said, a calm certainty in her tone. "Guests are temporary. I've been here longer than most of your guests stay interested." The sentence didn't land as sarcasm. It landed as truth. Michael's jaw tightened. He moved to the desk, snapped the lid shut on a pen, as if ending a conversation with a small, controlled finality, and motioned her toward the hall. "Out," he said. The hallway outside the study seemed to wait, as if the house itself were holding breath. Sarah walked through the doorway, but did not hurry. She did not plead, did not explain, did not offer a last-minute defense to soften his verdict. Her restraint had its own gravity. It was the weight of a mindset formed by experience, by decisions made in harder seasons than this. Michael followed, anger trailing him like a cloak he refused to shed. He wanted spectacle. He wanted a scene that would prove his authority. But there was no scene to be had. There was only a woman who refused to let his cruelty decide who she was. "Do you understand English?" he said harshly when she did not rush. "Go to your room. You have 30 minutes to gather your things. Security will escort you off the property." "I don't need an escort," she answered. "I know the way out." "Of course you do," he muttered. "The back door is where staff exit, not the front. Don't forget." She held his gaze for a moment, not with challenge, but with a kind of compassion that disarmed him in a way anger never could. He turned away first. Control to him meant movement, always moving, always commanding, always filling space with his will. He headed toward the main staircase, where the chandelier glowed like a constellation captured indoors. He called to the butler again, and this time a nervous face appeared at the edge of the hall. "Mr. Lawson?" the butler asked cautiously. "Have her escorted out," Michael said. "She's finished." The butler glanced at Sarah, hesitated, and then nodded. "Yes, sir." Sarah's room was small, tucked behind the laundry corridor. The walls were clean, the bed neat. A photograph of her younger sister tucked into the frame of the mirror. There was nothing extravagant, nothing that belonged to the family, just practical items and a few folded clothes. She began to place her things into a bag, with the same care she used in the study, as if even the act of leaving deserved precision. The younger maid, who often worked beside her, hovered in the doorway, eyes wide. "You can't go," the girl whispered. "He'll calm down, he always does." "Sometimes people need the consequence of their own decisions," Sarah said gently. "Maybe this is one of those times. You didn't do anything wrong." "I know." "Then why accept it?" "Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do," Sarah replied, "is refuse to become like the person trying to break you." The words fell softly, but they made the room feel fuller, grounded, as if gravity itself had shifted in her favor. The younger maid's eyes grew wet. "He doesn't see you," she said. "He sees a role. People see what their mindset allows," Sarah answered. "Eyes follow beliefs." Downstairs, Michael moved through the living room where the fire had been lit against the storm. He poured himself a drink and took a sharp sip he barely tasted. He was rehearsing the justification in his mind, leadership, boundaries, standards, stringing them together into a narrative to make his decision sound reasonable even to himself. It was a behind-the-scenes ritual he'd perfected through the years. Choose, command, rationalize, never look back. If he labeled the decision as necessary, he could ignore the impact. He could pretend the house felt cleaner, not just on its surfaces, but inside its atmosphere. Yet the air did not feel cleaner. It felt tight. He paced past the piano, past the wall, where black and white photographs told stories he claimed as his own. He paused before the largest frame, his grandfather breaking ground on the first factory, and stared at it as if the image could offer justification. "He wouldn't tolerate disrespect either," Michael said under his breath, as if summoning permission from a ghost. He heard steps at the top of the stairs. The butler. Something in the rhythm of the footsteps made Michael bristle. He wanted efficiency, not hesitation. He wanted the matter settled. He expected to see Sarah behind the butler, ready to be walked out, ready to vanish, the way staff were supposed to vanish when they no longer served the performance. Instead, the butler descended alone, hands clasped, face pale with uncertainty. "Well?" Michael asked. "She's packing," the butler said. There's a complication." "Complication?" Michael let out a breath that sounded like a warning. "What complication?" The butler swallowed. "Mrs. Lawson asked to be notified. If any staffing changes were made in the main house." Michael's expression hardened. "And she should perhaps be informed." "She doesn't need to approve my decisions," Michael said. "This is my house to manage." "Yes, sir," the butler murmured, though the words lacked conviction. Michael set down the glass with more force than necessary. "Fine. Inform her, but it won't change anything." Upstairs, Sarah zipped her bag and placed the photograph carefully between folded sweaters. She touched the edge of the mirror with her fingertips, a gesture not of farewell, but of gratitude for a place that had held her quiet for so long. The younger maid stood at the doorway as though at a border between two worlds. "Where will you go?" she asked. "I don't know yet," Sarah said, "but I've never been afraid of not knowing. It's the start of every real journey. You shouldn't have to leave because he's cruel." "People reveal themselves through pressure," Sarah said softly. "Sometimes it's the only way you can see the truth clearly." She lifted the bag and stepped toward the hall. The house felt different when you carried your life in your hands. The walls seemed taller, the floor longer, the light both colder and kinder. She moved with her usual grace, but every step offered quiet evidence. She could leave without bending. She could keep her dignity. That was the hidden truth that frightened men like Michael the most. When power fails to control, it scrambles to humiliate. He was waiting near the front foyer, posture rigid, voice ready. "I trust you took nothing that doesn't belong to you." "I took only what I brought," she said. "Good," he replied. "You'll be escorted off the property now." "I don't need anyone to walk me," she said gently. "I can exit." "Not through the front," he snapped. "The side door. Staff doesn't use the main entrance." She looked at the front door for a heartbeat, not with desire, but with understanding, and then turned toward the side corridor. "It makes no difference to me which door I use," she said. "The sky is the same outside either one." He flinched, as if the sentence had touched a nerve he'd been protecting. He wanted victory to feel like victory, not like pettiness. But the more he demanded order, the messier the portrait of himself became. The decision he had framed as leadership now looked, in the light of her composure, like insecurity in a suit. As Sarah moved toward the corridor, the storm gave a deep growl that trembled through the frame of the house. Everything seemed to hold for a second. The chandeliers, the water in the fountain, the breath of the staff tucked just out of sight. The butler waited half a step behind Sarah, hands folded, gaze low, ready to do the job, but unwilling in spirit. Michael watched, arms crossed, and told himself he was preserving boundaries, defending legacy, protecting his family's belongings from an imagined contamination. He told himself these lines because admitting the emptier truth that he needed people to be smaller than him in order to feel large would undo the story he had spent years building. Sarah paused at the mouth of the side corridor, turned slightly, and met his eyes one last time. "I hope you find what you're trying to protect," she said. "I hope it's worth what you're willing to lose." He opened his mouth to mock the sentiment, but the words did not come. Something in her tone, neither bitter nor pleading, removed the target he needed to aim at. Control slipped just an inch. He adjusted his tie as if that could refasten his certainty. The house listened as she took the first step down the narrow hall. It was a step that looked small, but carried the weight of a revelation. Strength does not depend on permission. And for the first time, the distance between Michael's version of himself and the man he truly was felt measured, visible, undeniable. He stood in the foyer, surrounded by objects that told a story of success, and yet he felt strangely absent from that story, as if his signature were on the glass, but missing from the substance behind it. Upstairs, a door opened, the soft, deliberate sound of someone who understood timing. Margaret's footsteps began across the landing, steady, unhurried, as if she were walking not into a conflict but into a truth that had been waiting for daylight. The journey that had started in whispers and chores and unacknowledged sacrifices was about to meet a voice capable of naming it, and the impact of that voice would not be measured in volume, but in what it revealed when spoken aloud. Margaret's footsteps were unmistakable, measured, steady, carrying the quiet authority of someone who had built this house long before Michael learned to claim it. She appeared at the top of the staircase, wrapped in a slate-grey shawl, hair brushed back, eyes clear. The chandelier light touched the lines at the corners of her face and revealed not frailty, but resolve. She took in the foyer with a single glance. Sarah at the mouth of the side corridor holding her bag, the butler immobilized by duty and concern, Michael planted in the center of the room as if proximity to the front door proved ownership. For a heartbeat, the only sound was rain threading itself against the windows like a patient hand tracing glass. Then Margaret spoke, and the house remembered who taught it to listen. "Sarah," she said, voice even, "put your things down." The request landed with the authority of a verdict. Sarah froze, then gently lowered her bag to the polished floor. She did not look relieved, she looked prepared. Michael turned sharply toward his mother, irritation rising like heat. "Mother, this is not your concern," he said. "I've made a decision." Margaret continued down the steps without haste. "I can see that," she replied, the softness of her tone framing steel. "I can also see it's the wrong one." He gave a short laugh to disguise discomfort. "You haven't even asked why." "I don't need to ask why to know what this is," she answered. "I can recognize the shape of pride when it walks through my house." The butler lowered his gaze. The younger maid, still halfway down the service hallway, edged closer, drawn by a gravity that felt inevitable. Sarah's posture didn't change, but something in her eyes settled, like the moment a ship finds the center of the current. The power dynamic shifted almost imperceptibly as Margaret reached the foyer, a kind of behind-the-scenes recalibration that only those fluent in unspoken hierarchies could read. "Mother," Michael said, forcing a calmer tone. "Sarah overstepped. She was in the study without permission, near items that belong to this family. I won't have staff treating priceless belongings like ordinary trinkets. It's a matter of boundaries." Margaret looked at him as though examining the architecture of the excuse rather than the words themselves. "Boundaries," she repeated, nodding once. "And what boundary did she cross that justifies being sent out in a storm with a bag and a warning?" "She shouldn't be handling family history," he maintained. "That room is not for her." "That room is not a shrine to your ego," Margaret said, still calm. "It holds memories. Memories require care, not posturing." She shifted her attention to Sarah with a tenderness that didn't need performance. "Have you harmed anything?" "No, Ma'am," Sarah replied. "I was cleaning. The schedule hasn't changed." "It has not," Margaret said. "I wrote it." Michael opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "This isn't about a schedule," he said. "It's about respect." "Respect," Margaret echoed. "A useful word, dangerous in the wrong hands." She gestured toward the study doors. "If you think respect for our past means humiliating the person who preserves it, then your definition is not one I recognize." He bristled. "I'm not humiliating anyone. I'm managing the house." "You are managing a feeling," she said. "A feeling of threat. And you're calling it management." The line reached him more cleanly than he expected. Threat was not a word he allowed near his image. He squared his shoulders as if to push it back into the shadows, where he kept anything that made power look fragile. "I won't debate semantics," he said. "I gave an order. It stands." Margaret's eyes did not harden. They clarified. "No," she said, "it doesn't." She turned slightly, including the butler and the hallway staff in her orbit. "There will be no dismissal today." Then to Sarah, "You will not leave this house under accusation." Sarah inhaled a quiet breath that didn't ask for rescue. "I can go if it keeps the peace," she said. "There is no peace built on fear," Margaret replied. "Only silence, and we are finished with that kind of silence." For a long second, the word "finished" seemed to rest in the air like a key placed on a table between two people who both know what it opens. Michael felt the edges of his certainty begin to crumble. He had been sure that the sheer force of decision would carry the day. That had always been the way to win. But his mother's refusal was not rebellion. It was governance. It came from history, from decisions made long before he was old enough to misunderstand them. "Mother," he said more carefully, shifting tactics, "if I let insubordination pass, it spreads. This is how standards fall." "And this," Margaret said, touching the banister as if to steady only the facts, "is how a family falls, when it believes. Standards exist to protect feelings rather than values." Her tone never rose. If anything, it grew gentler, which somehow made each sentence land with greater impact. "You've mistaken the performance of authority for the practice of it." He didn't know where to put his hands. He slipped them into his pockets, removed them, adjusted his cuff, then let his arms hang rigidly at his sides. "You're choosing her over me," he said, a boy's accusation wearing a man's voice. "I am choosing what is right over what is loud," Margaret answered, "and I am choosing the truth over the story you've rehearsed." The chandelier hummed faintly, its light steady, as if refusing to dramatize what did not require dramatics. The house, which had been a stage for Michael, was becoming a forum, less spectacle, more reckoning. The shift wasn't just in the room, it was inside him. He felt the hidden truth press against his ribs. His decisions were not unassailable. He could be challenged without the world collapsing. The realization was not relief, it was exposure. Sarah looked between them, the son fighting to hold the frame, the mother quietly removing the nails. She had no interest in triumph. She had interest in clarity. "Mrs. Lawson," she said softly, "I don't want to be the cause of conflict." "You are not the cause," Margaret replied. "You are the mirror." The younger maid nearly gasped at the accuracy. The butler's chin dipped in agreement. No one could call defiance, only recognition. Michael felt cornered by gentleness, which was worse than anger. Anger he knew how to defeat. Gentleness required something he had not practiced: listening. "We could move past this if she apologizes," he said finally, reaching for a compromise that let him stand without bowing. "For what?" Margaret asked. "For entering the study alone? She did her job. For answering me in a tone I didn't appreciate." "She spoke in a tone you needed," Margaret said. "Calm, precise, true." He flushed. "So, there's nothing she can do wrong." "She can do many things wrong," Margaret said. "She did not do one of them today." Then, after a measured pause, "You did." The words were not a slap. They were a diagnosis. He felt himself want to reject them on principle, but principle wavered when facts stood this close. Still he reached for the only weapon pride knows. "If I'm not allowed to manage the house, then say so," he said. "Say the power is yours and not mine." "The power," Margaret said, "belongs to whatever serves the family's integrity." She looked at him with a tenderness he didn't expect. "That includes you when you remember who you are." He tried to hold her gaze and found it heavy with history. Late nights, early lessons, the quiet arithmetic of sacrifice. He looked away first, which surprised him. Out of habit his eyes sought the proof of legacy on the walls, the photographs, the frames, the signatures, yet they seemed suddenly flatter, like props. Integrity, inconveniently, had no frame. "Sarah will stay," Margaret said, returning to action the way a conductor returns a wandering orchestra to the original key. "Her work is not in question. Her character is not in question. Only your reaction is." Sarah stood straighter but did not exhale triumph. "Thank you," she said simply. "I'll return to my duties." "Before you do," Margaret added, "leave your bag here. I'll have someone take it back to your room." "I can carry it," Sarah replied. "But thank you." The exchange was brief, but it moved like a seam stitched exactly where the fabric had threatened to split. Michael recognized with reluctant clarity how often small decisions created the architecture of a day. He had made a decision to erase. His mother countered with a decision to restore. And restoration, he saw, carried a different kind of power, quieter, more enduring. He reached once more for posture. "If we begin making exceptions, the staff will take advantage," he warned. "The only people who take advantage," Margaret said, "are those who believe advantage is the point." The sentence landed in him with the soft, relentless logic of rain finding a roofline. He had believed advantage was the point for so long that he had confused it with purpose. In that confusion, people had become tools, and tools don't ask questions. But Sarah's presence, her refusal to shatter under pressure, had become a question he couldn't put down. Margaret took a step closer to him, her voice intimate now, meant for his hearing as much as for the room's record. "You treat the house like a fortress," she said, "but houses are not built to keep people small. They're built to give people room to grow." She let the thought breathe, then added, "If you cannot feel larger without making someone else less, you are not growing. You are shrinking inside a very expensive shell." The line was not designed to wound, it was designed to wake. He felt heat rise in his chest, pride fighting for oxygen. He considered doubling down. He considered walking out. He considered every move that looked like strength from a distance and avoidance up close. The choices rushed past him like exits on a highway he'd been speeding down for years. For once, he didn't take any of them. He stood still. Sarah quietly lifted her bag and placed it beside the console table. The butler stepped forward, hands precise, and said, "Allow me, Miss Sarah." She let him, and the gesture wove a small thread of normalcy through a room that had nearly unraveled. The younger maid retreated a step, wiping at her eyes, pretending it was dust, not relief. Michael felt the oddness of the moment. Nothing dramatic had happened, and yet everything felt altered. It wasn't a spectacle of reversal. It was a transformation of ground. The coordinates of authority had shifted a few degrees toward true north, and once a compass corrects, it's difficult to pretend the old direction was right. He tried one last angle. "You're protecting her as though she's family," he said. Margaret didn't blink. "I protect what protects us," she replied, "and I honor what has earned honor." He stared at her, at Sarah, at the staircase, searching for a lever to pull that would return the moment to its previous shape. There wasn't one. The revelation arrived not as thunder, but as a steady light. Whatever argument he made from here would not be about justice, it would be about saving face. And saving face, he realized, had cost him more than he had ever counted. A silence gathered, a useful one, the kind that holds a decision at the center until it becomes visible. Margaret released him from it gently. "Michael," she said, "you may not understand why I'm firm about this, but you will. And when you do, you'll be grateful the house did not let your anger write its rules." He swallowed, nodded once, and let his arms ease from their rigid line. It wasn't surrender. It was the first movement of a different posture, small enough to deny if needed, large enough to start a new pattern. Sarah inclined her head. "I'll return to the study," she said. "There's dust on the upper shelf I didn't reach." "You'll have help," Margaret answered, already shifting the room back into rhythm. "And you'll take a warm tea first." She turned to the butler. "Earl Grey, lemon, honey." "Yes, ma'am," the butler said, relieved to have a task that built rather than broke. Margaret faced her son again, eyes not accusing but steady. "Walk with me," she said. "We have more to discuss than a baseball behind glass." Something in the invitation, firm, unafraid, woven with history, cut through his resistance. He didn't know what the conversation would unveil, but he felt its direction, less defense, more truth. As they moved toward the corridor side by side, the storm outside softened by a degree, the rain no longer striking the window panes like a verdict, but like a rhythm the house had learned to accept. In the foyer, Sarah lifted her cup when it arrived, and let the steam brush her face, not as celebration, but as a quiet reset. The journey of the day had bent away from humiliation and toward clarity, and clarity changes the temperature of a room. She set the cup down and returned to the study with measured steps, the kind a person takes when they know the floor will hold, and when they know that the next conversation, somewhere down a hall, is already rearranging old narratives to make room for what has always been true. Margaret guided her son into the quieter wing of the house, where the walls were lined not with trophies or portraits meant to impress, but with older photographs, black and white and sepia-toned, the kind that carried memory rather than display. She walked slowly, her hand brushing the banister as if grounding herself in the familiar path, while Michael followed, stiff but subdued, the echo of their exchange still hanging between them. They stopped before a small framed picture of a summer picnic. One Michael barely remembered. In it, a much younger version of himself sat on a blanket under an oak tree, his face pale but smiling faintly, and beside him was Sarah, not in uniform but in a simple dress, holding a basket and watching him with an attentiveness that seemed to anchor the entire scene. Michael frowned, trying to summon details. "That was the summer I got sick, wasn't it?" Margaret nodded. "It was. You were 10 years old. Pneumonia. The doctors said it could go either way." Her voice didn't rise, but the memory sharpened her words with quiet gravity. "I stayed at your bedside day and night until exhaustion nearly broke me, and when I couldn't keep my eyes open any longer, Sarah stepped in. She sat with you, cooled your fever, sang softly when you drifted in and out. There were nights when I woke and found her still there, holding your hand, whispering that you were strong enough to keep breathing." Michael blinked, unsettled. He searched the edges of memory for the faint sound of a voice. In the dark, a cool hand on his forehead. He had always believed his recovery was just the work of medicine, of time, of his own resilience. But fragments stirred, half-forgotten comfort, the sense of not being alone in the long hours of fever. "That was her?" he asked. "It was her," Margaret said. "When the hospital sent you home, it was Sarah who carried the weight of care when my strength failed. She gave more of herself than we ever asked, and never once did she request acknowledgement. She became part of this family not because of a paycheck, but because she held us together in a season when we might have broken apart." The revelation pressed against him like a tide. He looked again at the photograph, at the younger version of himself with hollow cheeks and tired eyes, and the woman sitting beside him with quiet devotion. For years he had looked past her, treating her as background, but here she was, frozen in proof of a history he had never honored. Margaret continued, her tone steady but edged with the sharpness of truth. "You think she doesn't belong in this house? This house stands because of people like her. You boast about legacy, about what it means to carry a family name. But legacies aren't built only on fortunes and deals. They're built on sacrifices, and Sarah's sacrifices are woven into the very walls you believe give you authority." Michael's hands tightened into fists at his sides, not in anger at her words, but in resistance to what they revealed. His pride battled against the image being redrawn before him. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" he asked, his voice strained. "Because I hoped you would see it for yourself," Margaret replied. "I hoped you would notice her loyalty, her patience, her strength, without me needing to hold up the evidence. But arrogance blinds, Michael, and today you nearly pushed away someone whose presence is a greater gift to this family than all the chandeliers and marble combined." He swallowed. The room, feeling tighter, the air heavier. His thoughts reached for justification, for the scripts he usually carried, about boundaries, about leadership, about standards. But those words rang hollow against the weight of the truth. What excuse could he give when faced with the fact that the woman he tried to throw out had once kept him alive? "I don't remember everything from that summer," he admitted quietly, eyes still fixed on the photo. "But I do remember not feeling alone. I thought it was you." "It was both of us," Margaret said softly. "I couldn't have done it without her, and you wouldn't be standing here if she hadn't been there too." The hallway seemed to hum with the impact of the revelation, as if even the house itself carried memory in its beams and plaster. The butler, still hovering at a respectful distance, lowered his head, acknowledging a truth he had long known but never spoken aloud. The younger maid, lingering at the edge, pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes wet, as though hearing the story for the first time made her see Sarah not as a co-worker, but as something more enduring, more essential. Michael ran a hand through his hair, his posture faltering. He had built his self-image on the belief that wealth secured control, that possessions secured worth. But the hidden story of his own life told something entirely different, that his survival, his very ability to claim this legacy, had been safeguarded by someone he now dismissed as unworthy. The contradiction burned. He turned abruptly, walking a few steps down the hall before stopping, his voice rough. "So all this time, she was more than what I thought." "She always was," Margaret said. "The difference is that now you're forced to see it." The storm outside had eased into a steady rain, but inside the house, the storm had shifted inward, becoming a reckoning. Michael stood in the half-light of memory and realization, his mindset cracking under the weight of what had been revealed. His journey, whether he admitted it yet or not, had already begun. And as he faced the truth about Sarah's past, the foundation of everything he believed about belonging, family, and authority was beginning to move beneath his feet, leading him toward a transformation he never anticipated. Michael stood in the dim hallway, his eyes locked on the photograph of himself as a sickly boy, Sarah's figure seated beside him, her presence steady and unmistakable. The more he looked, the more the image unraveled his carefully built certainty. The mansion's polished floors, the chandeliers that glittered like captured stars, the marble pillars that had once made him feel untouchable. All of it seemed suddenly shallow, like scenery on a stage where the true actors had been hidden behind the curtain all along. He had thought himself the lead in this story, but Margaret's words had shifted the spotlight, exposing the behind-the-scenes truth he had ignored. He turned toward his mother, searching for some thread of dignity to hold on to. "Why didn't you ever tell me this?" he asked again, his voice quieter now, stripped of the bite it carried earlier. Margaret's gaze softened, though it did not waver. "Because humility cannot be taught with lectures, Michael. It has to be discovered. It's a decision you make when life gives you the mirror you've been avoiding." Her words pressed against him harder than any public scolding could have. Humiliation burned in his chest, not because servants had witnessed his arrogance, but because his mother, the one person whose approval had always mattered most, was standing against him. It wasn't the crowd's judgment he feared, but hers. Her disapproval felt like the withdrawal of something invisible, yet vital, as if the foundation of his identity had been quietly pulled away. He lowered his gaze, his pride trembling under the weight of truth. For the first time in years, the voice of certainty in his mind faltered. He remembered the child he had been, feverish and weak, clinging to consciousness while unfamiliar hands soothed him. He remembered warmth at his side, whispers that carried him through the night. He had believed those moments belonged to his mother alone, but now he realized Sarah had been there too, her presence shaping the safety he had taken for granted. He tried to respond, but words failed. I didn't know," he murmured, and the admission itself stung like a wound. "No," Margaret said gently, "you didn't want to know. You never looked closely enough to see the sacrifices around you. That is what arrogance does. It blinds you to the gifts carried by others." Her tone wasn't angry. It was worse. It was disappointed, steady and calm, as though anger would have been wasted. That disappointment stripped Michael more thoroughly than rage ever could. He felt exposed, as if the layers of charm and dominance he had wrapped around himself had been peeled away, leaving only the boy he once was, the boy who had depended on others to survive, the boy who owed his life to someone he had just tried to discard. He clenched his fists, then released them, his voice unsteady. "I thought wealth meant I had control. I thought respect came with the name, with the house, with everything we owned." Margaret shook her head slowly. "Wealth gives you options, Michael, but respect? That is earned only by how you treat others. Money cannot buy it, and arrogance cannot hold it." The words landed like stones in a pond, rippling through the silence until they reached him fully. He had been raised in privilege, yet in this moment, privilege felt more like a cage than a crown. What good was all his dominance if it collapsed under the weight of a truth revealed by his own mother? He felt smaller in her presence, not because she intended to diminish him, but because she had reminded him of something he had abandoned long ago: gratitude. He rubbed a hand over his face, trying to find composure, but humiliation lingered like a shadow he couldn't escape. He thought of the butler's eyes lowered in quiet disapproval, of the younger maid's trembling voice defending Sarah earlier, of Sarah herself, calm and dignified even when he tried to strip her of belonging. Each memory was another crack in his armor. "I wanted to prove I could manage this house," he said, voice breaking slightly, "that I could live up to the legacy." Margaret stepped closer, her expression softening just enough to pierce him deeper. "Legacy is not about control, Michael. It is about gratitude for those who made survival possible. You think managing a house makes you strong, but true strength is recognizing that others carry the weight with you and thanking them for it." The words cut, but they also illuminated. He realized now that his humiliation wasn't just about being wrong, it was about being revealed. All the hidden truths he had ignored were spilling into the open, and his mother was holding him accountable not with anger, but with undeniable honesty. That honesty left no room for excuses. He pressed his lips together, swallowing hard. "I didn't mean to dishonor her." "You did," Margaret replied. But what matters is what you do next. Her voice lingered in the air, firm but guiding, leaving the decision in his hands. Humiliation had cracked his arrogance, but reflection was the path forward. He could feel it, the faint stirring of a transformation waiting beneath the weight of shame, like a seed pressed into the soil. Uncertain, yet alive. Michael turned back toward the foyer where Sarah's bag still sat by the console table, untouched, a silent witness to everything that had just unfolded. He saw it differently now, not as baggage, but as a symbol of all the years she had carried burdens for this family without complaint. Each folded garment inside spoke of early mornings, long nights, decisions made in quiet sacrifice, and he had nearly thrown it, and her, out as if it meant nothing. The humiliation tightened in his chest, but with it came a reflection he couldn't escape. Maybe wealth had blinded him, maybe pride had hardened him, but this moment could decide what kind of man he became next. Would he cling to arrogance, or let gratitude rebuild what his ego had destroyed? He glanced at his mother again, and for the first time in years, he didn't see her as an obstacle, but as a guide. Her disapproval wasn't meant to shame him into silence. It was meant to call him back to the person he was supposed to be. And though his pride still resisted, another part of him began to understand. The rain outside had softened to a drizzle, the storm easing into a rhythm almost reflective, as though the world itself mirrored the quiet transformation stirring in the mansion. Michael inhaled slowly, his chest heavy but clearer, his thoughts circling not around dominance, but around the possibility of change. Humiliation had broken him open. Reflection was beginning to fill the cracks. And as his mother's words settled into him like seeds in soil, he realized that this reckoning was not an ending, but the beginning of something that could reshape not just his mindset, but his entire journey with the people he had taken for granted for far too long. Michael lingered in the hallway longer than he wanted to, as if the walls themselves were demanding an answer to questions he wasn't ready to face. He felt stripped, not by force, but by the weight of truth pressing against him from every angle. His mother's disappointment clung to him like a second skin, and Sarah's silence, steady, unshaken, remained louder than any argument he could mount. For a man who had always defined himself by control, the sudden loss of certainty felt like standing barefoot on cold marble, nowhere to hide, nothing to grip. He looked at his reflection in the tall mirror by the console table, the one he usually passed with quick glances, meant only to adjust his tie. But this time, the mirror showed something he couldn't ignore. His posture still carried the frame of confidence, but his eyes betrayed it. They were tired, defensive, filled with a shadow of doubt that looked dangerously close to recognition. For years, he had used wealth as armor, charm as disguise, and arrogance as shield. But in this moment the armor looked heavy, the disguise thin and the shield cracked. Margaret stood nearby, silent now, giving him the space to wrestle with himself. She knew words had already done their work. What remained was decision, and no one could make it for him. Sarah had returned to the study, resuming her tasks with the same composure as always, yet her absence in the hall felt more powerful than her presence had been. She hadn't pleaded for his mercy, hadn't demanded justice, hadn't even tried to defend herself beyond a few calm sentences. That restraint haunted him, because it revealed something he lacked. He remembered her final words before she nearly left the house. "I hope you find what you're trying to protect. I hope it's worth what you're willing to lose." At the time, he had dismissed it as a servant's attempt at dignity, but now those words replayed in his mind like a key turning inside a lock. What was he trying to protect? Pride, image, legacy? And if so, why did it suddenly feel hollow? He walked slowly toward the study, his steps hesitant, as if each one demanded he peel back another layer of himself. When he reached the doorway, he saw Sarah dusting the upper shelves again, her movement steady, unaffected by the storm of words that had nearly expelled her from the house. He cleared his throat, but the sound came out weaker than intended. She turned slightly, meeting his eyes without hostility, without triumph. There was something disarming about the absence of bitterness in her gaze. "Sarah," he said, the name almost catching in his throat, I owe you an apology." Her hands paused mid-motion, but she did not lower the cloth. "You don't owe me words, Mr. Lawson," she replied gently. "You owe yourself honesty." He flinched slightly at the precision of her response. She wasn't dismissing him, but she wasn't making the apology easy either. It forced him to go deeper, past the surface of pride. "I was wrong," he admitted, each syllable feeling heavier than the last. "I treated you like you didn't matter. I tried to erase you from this house when the truth is, it stands because of you." She lowered the cloth now, turning fully toward him. Her face was calm, not smug, not vengeful, just steady. "Respect doesn't cost you anything, Michael," she said softly, "but losing it will cost you everything." The sentence hit him harder than his mother's scolding had. It wasn't a rebuke. It was a truth delivered with such clarity that it pierced through his defenses. He nodded, his throat tight. "I thought respect came with wealth, that people owed it to me. But I see now, it's the other way around." Sarah studied him for a moment, then gave a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "People follow kindness longer than they follow orders. You'll discover that if you choose to." Her forgiveness wasn't loud, but it was evident in the fact that she continued her work without resentment, without throwing his humiliation back at him. She carried no need to prove him wrong. She had already done so by being who she was. That quiet forgiveness highlighted the contrast he could no longer ignore. Humility over ego, patience over pride, humanity over dominance. Michael leaned against the doorway, watching her dust the shelves he had once accused her of trespassing on. He realized how small his arrogance looked in comparison to her consistency. Every moment of her endurance became a mirror reflecting his flaws, but also showing him a path he could still take if he had the courage. It wasn't about surrender, it was about transformation. He turned back to his mother, who stood a few paces behind, watching silently. "I don't want to be the man I was this morning," he said, voice unsteady. Margaret's eyes softened. "Then don't be. Transformation begins the moment you choose differently." The words carried more weight than any lecture on legacy or wealth. They carried choice, agency, the possibility of change. For the first time, Michael felt that humility wasn't weakness. It was freedom from the cage of his own pride. He stepped fully into the study, his gaze steady on Sarah now. "I can't undo the way I treated you," he said quietly, "but I can change the way I see you, and I can choose to honor the truth I've ignored for too long." She gave a slight nod, accepting the words without ceremony. "It's not about me," she replied. "It's about who you decide to become." Her response lodged itself inside him, deep enough to shift something fundamental. He realized this moment wasn't about repairing his image, wasn't about salvaging authority. It was about transformation, about becoming the kind of man who no longer needed wealth as proof of worth. Respect and kindness, two things he had undervalued, now loomed larger than all the marble and chandeliers around him. The silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It was spacious, like a clearing after a storm. And though the rain still fell outside, it no longer sounded like judgment. It sounded like renewal, washing the windows clean, readying the mansion and Michael himself for something entirely different. And as Sarah quietly returned to her work and Margaret turned away with the quiet satisfaction of someone who knew a seed had been planted, Michael stood still in the study, no longer clinging to control, but standing at the threshold of a journey that would demand humility, gratitude, and choices far different from the ones he had made before. The transformation had only just begun, and its impact would ripple far beyond the walls of the mansion. The house settled into a softer quiet, the kind that follows a storm, not because the sky has cleared completely, but because something inside has finally decided to stop fighting the rain. In that quiet, Michael found the courage to move. He left the study and crossed the hall with a slower pace than anyone in the house had ever seen from him. not the stride of a man performing importance, but the careful steps of someone measuring the distance between the person he had been and the person he wanted to become. He paused in the foyer where Sarah's bag still rested by the console, a modest thing with worn handles and a zipper that stuck at one end. It looked out of place against the marble and the gilded mirror, yet for the first time he understood that what was out of place was not the bag, but the mindset that had believed the house existed only to magnify him. He asked the butler to gather the household in the dining room, and the request came out stripped of command. The staff came quietly, unsure. They took their places along the wall as they always did, standing slightly back, ready to vanish at the first sign of criticism. Sarah did not return to the doorway. She remained in the study, finishing what she had started, as if the rhythm of duty could smooth the surface of a shaken day. Margaret watched her son from the threshold, saying nothing, letting the next decisions belong to him. When Michael entered the dining room, the chandelier cast its light without drama, illuminating a long table set for no one in particular. He cleared his throat, and even that small sound betrayed how unused he was to speaking without armor. "I owe everyone in this house an apology," he said, and the line stilled the room. "Not just for today, but for every day I treated your work as invisible and your presence as optional." The butler lowered his eyes. The younger maid glanced toward Sarah's empty chair and swallowed. Michael continued, voice roughened by something more honest than performance. "I thought leadership meant control. I thought respect was something I received, not something I earned. I was wrong. That's not an excuse. It's the truth I should have seen sooner." He turned to Margaret as if steadying himself against what he had to say next. "Mother told me something I should have known," he added. "When I was 10 and sick and more fragile than any picture frame in this house, it was Sarah who sat with me through the nights. I don't remember all of it, but I remember not being alone. I have taken that comfort for granted for years." He drew a breath that felt like opening a door from the inside. "Sarah isn't just staff. She's part of what holds this family together, and I nearly repaid that with humiliation." A chair leg scraped softly as the younger maid shifted, tears bright at the corners of her eyes. The chef folded his arms across his chest as if to keep a feeling contained. The house no longer felt like a stage. It felt like a witness. Margaret stepped forward, just enough to stand at his shoulder, not in front of him, not behind him, but beside him, in the way that makes support visible without taking a man's step for him. "Go on," she said quietly. Michael nodded. He left the dining room and crossed to the study, where Sarah stood on a small step stool, finishing the upper shelf he had accused her of touching without permission. He waited until she stepped down before he spoke. "Sarah," he said, "I want to apologize to you directly. I treated you like a trespasser in a place you have helped build. I tried to make you small so I could feel large. I cannot undo that. But I can tell you, I see you now, not as a function, not as a uniform, but as a human being whose loyalty has carried this family farther than any of us acknowledged." She held his gaze, and for a long second, nothing moved. Then she set the cloth on the cart and answered with the same quiet clarity that had steadied the whole day. "Thank you for saying it," she replied. "I don't need grand gestures. I need truth that lasts longer than a mood." He felt the sentence land like a commitment written without flourish. She added, softer still, "And I forgive you, not because it didn't hurt, but because holding on would change me into someone I don't want to become." The words slipped past his defenses in a way lectures never could. Forgiveness wasn't a spectacle. It was a reorientation. It didn't erase the impact of his decisions, but it showed him a road not paved with shame. He nodded once, a gesture that felt like a promise sealed to himself more than to her. "I will try to deserve that," he said. That evening, the dining table was reset, not for a gala or clients, but for the people who made the house breathe. The chef, the gardeners, the maids, the butler, the driver who always waited in the car long after he was told to go home. Margaret insisted everyone sit, and when hesitation kept them hovering at the edges, she smiled in that particular way that leaves no room for refusal. "Tonight," she said, "we eat as a family." The word family did not erase titles. It dignified the people who had been reduced to them. Michael took a seat halfway down the table rather than at the head, and the gesture surprised even him. He poured water for the person beside him and, without thinking, set the pitcher down where others could reach it. A small habit, but it marked a turn in the road. The conversation was not easy at first. Glances lowered, voices careful, but Margaret kept the room warm with the simplest kind of hospitality: attention. She asked the driver about his daughter's college applications and reminded the chef of the first winter soup he had made when the power went out 10 years ago. She prompted, they answered, and slowly the ice beneath the evening's chairs began to melt. When Sarah entered, she did not seek the end of the table. She took the place Margaret indicated with a small nod, near the center, between the younger maid and the gardener, who still carried soil beneath his nails, no matter how often he washed up. Michael stood, and the room went still again. He didn't raise a glass, he didn't ask for silence, he simply used the voice he had been learning how to use all day. "I want to acknowledge Sarah," he said, "not as an employee, but as someone whose quiet decisions have protected this family more than any address ever could. I would like this house to hold a photograph where the truth is visible." He turned to Margaret. "If you're willing, Mother, I'd like that picture from the hallway moved to the main wall, the one of the picnic, the one that tells the story behind the scenes." Margaret's eyes smiled before her mouth did. "Yes," she said. "It belongs where memory can teach more than marble can impress." A soft murmur passed around the table, the kind that means agreement without ceremony. Sarah didn't beam. She didn't shrink either. She placed her hands calmly in her lap and let gratitude be as plain as her uniform. "That's kind," she said. "But please remember, photographs are reminders, not replacements. Live the respect you're framing." "I will," Michael answered, and for once the line contained more promise than performance. They ate then, and the meal tasted different, not because of seasoning, but because of the shift in air that comes when a hidden truth is finally allowed to breathe. The chef told a story about the first time he oversalted a sauce and how Sarah had quietly diluted it, saving the dish without making him look foolish. The gardener spoke about the winter storm that took down the south fence and how Sarah arrived in boots at dawn with thermoses of coffee. Each story was a revelation, not of heroics, but of constancy. Michael listened without interrupting, a practice he realized had muscle memory too, one he would need to build. When the plates were cleared, Margaret remained seated, hands folded, and offered a closing not as a verdict but as a thread binding the day. "Wealth gave this house a foundation," she said, her voice carrying the hush of a prayer without the formality of one. "But kindness made it livable. Money can purchase stone and glass. Respect furnishes the rooms. Never confuse what can be bought with what must be earned." She let her eyes rest briefly on her son. "Our worth is measured by the lives we touch with gentleness, our legacy by the gratitude we practice when no one is watching." Michael felt the words settle where defenses had once stood. He glanced at the staff and found himself wanting to know their names beyond titles, their stories beyond tasks. He realized how much of his life had been lived at a distance, admiring the shine of things while missing the hands that made them shine. The transformation he needed wasn't a speech. It was a series of decisions, repeated until they turned into character. He understood there would be days he would fail, habits that would fight back, instincts that would request applause. But humility is a muscle, not a miracle. He would lift it again tomorrow. Later, when the table was cleared and the rain had thinned to a mist, he returned to the hallway with the photographs and stood once more before the picnic image. He traced the frame lightly, seeing in it not nostalgia, but instruction. He imagined a new frame in the main living room, visible, unignorable, a reminder at eye level that the story of this house was never singular. "We'll move it in the morning," he said quietly. Sarah passed by on her way to the kitchen. She paused. "You don't have to prove anything to me," she said. "Just be true to what you've learned." "I'm trying," he replied. "That's how it begins," she said, and kept walking, leaving him with a sentence that felt like a small lamp left on in a darkened room. In the library, Margaret closed a ledger she had been reviewing and looked up as he entered. He took the seat across from her, a place where, as a boy, he'd fallen asleep doing math homework while she balanced the household accounts. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" she asked lightly. "For not letting my worst moment decide the shape of this house," he answered. "For calling me back." She reached across and placed her hand over his, a gesture simple and vast. "You did the difficult part," she said. "You listened." He nodded, and in that quiet exchange, a new chapter began. Not dramatic, not shouted, but written in the ink of everyday choices. A door held open, a name remembered, a question asked before an order given. By the time the house settled for the night, the air carried a different texture. The walls had not moved, but the meaning inside them had. Respect had been spoken aloud, and then set gently on the table like bread to be shared. The hidden truth had been brought from behind the scenes into the center of the room, where its impact could guide what came next. And as the lamps clicked off one by one, the mansion did not feel smaller for having welcomed humility. It felt larger, as if space had been made for everyone who crossed its thresholds. Morning would come with new rhythms, breakfast served with conversation instead of commands, schedules adjusted with collaboration rather than control, a photograph lifted from a quiet hallway to a place of honor where memory could teach in passing. The journey was not over. It had reached the honest part, the place where lessons don't end with words, but continue in the way people live beside one another. And in that gentle pull forward, the house seemed to breathe, ready to hold the next revelation that would give shape to all the days that followed. And if you've walked with me through this entire story, maybe you felt something shift along the way too. Perhaps it reminded you of a moment when humility taught more than pride ever could, or when quiet strength left a deeper impact than loud power. If that's the case, let me know down in the comments. Just write something simple, like, "I'm with you until the end, so I know you stayed and felt the weight of this journey." And if these kinds of stories resonate with you, don't forget to subscribe. That way, you'll always have a place here where narratives like this keep unfolding, with lessons tucked inside each one. A like on this video also helps keep these messages reaching others who might need them right now. And since the journey doesn't stop here, there's another video waiting that complements everything we've just explored. It's right here. Click and continue with me there. I think you'll find it speaks just as deeply.